Hello and welcome to Roadmap 2023, our election issues and personalities tracking program. I am Ladi Akeredoluale. Thanks for joining us. There are quite a lot of takeaways from the election circle which the nation is currently undergoing. My guest says amongst the key ones are issues surrounding voter turnout, logistics and funding for elections management. My guest also says he thinks a redesign and reappreciation of the roles political parties should play in elections processing, including in contestation of results, is very important. Roadmap 2023 talks to the Executive Director of the Center for Journalism, Innovation and Development, CJID, Dr. Toby Oluwatola. Dr. Oluwatola, thank you for your time. Welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me, Ladi.
Let's begin from some of the takeaways, if you like, from the election season. One of the things that appears to be uppermost is the fact that in spite of much of the hype, if you like, prior to the exercises themselves, we have witnessed yet again low voter turnout in this election season. To what would you ascribe that, if you agree? Is it a question of, there was just too much said, and on the day, so many of those who spoke didn't come out, or were there other factors?
Thanks, Ladi. I think that, so you make a great point that we had about 26% turnout, 27% turnout, 26.7 precisely, to be precise, percent turnout of people who are registered to vote, who came out to vote. And that's despite that we've had increased number of registered voters. In the last election in 2019, we had about 35% people of the people registered to vote come out to vote. And even in absolute numbers, we had only about 24.7 million people vote this time around, as against about 28 million in 2019 and about 29 million in 2015. So despite increased number of registered voters, you have a turnout that is an absolute number that is depressed and a turnout that is significantly depressed. And I think there are at least three factors that I will attribute to that occurrence to. One is this election we experienced a very an exogenous suppressant, which was the issue around the Naira redesign policy. Many people did not have cash to get around. Many people did not have cash or fuel to get around. So that was a very a curveball that was thrown in wrenches at the dying minute by the central bank and to some degree NMPC. So I think there needs to be some accountability in that regard. Secondly, I also think that the numbers that we saw this election season, even though there was a lot of enthusiasm, was depressed because perhaps for the first time we're getting a very accurate picture of the number of people who actually come out to vote. Prior to this time around, we didn't have the bimodal voter accreditation system that gave us a means of making sure that the people who actually voted at the votes that are counted. And in the past, we would just have ballot boxes be stuffed. This time around, that could not happen. So that also had a reflection. And I am very keen to see what impact that has on the census that we have a little later in the month. We're now being told that that's going to be postponed till May. Fingers crossed to see what happens in that regard. But again, I think that Saturday gives us another test of really how much people want to come out to vote. We'll see by Saturday what turnouts look like. One third point I will make is that this election also saw, for the first time again, in recent times, since 1999, four major party candidates cutting across geopolitical zones. And you had increased turnout in the Southeast relative to what we used to have historically, and somewhat depressed turnout in the north, where we will historically have really large turnouts when President Muhammadu Buhari ran in the time cycles that he ran. So again, you see that there's also perhaps also an effect of the fervency of young people or people in the regions where the emergent candidates and the exciting candidates, some may call the exciting candidates, the candidate, the challenger was coming from. I think that also might have had an effect. Perhaps if Peter Obi had been from the north, perhaps we might have had a different outcome in terms of turnout. But altogether, I think that I think the biggest takeaway may be that we finally see a reflection of people's willingness to come out. And even though more people came out than it would historically come out, the numbers are low, as they probably should be. And one more point I'd like to make is that perhaps now is the time to also audit the INEC voter register, because we have 89 million people who've collected PVCs. Many of those people, some of those people have died. Many of those people have relocated. So perhaps the turnout is better than we're claiming it is, just because our denominator is too high.
Now, I'm happy you mentioned INEC, because that was going to be my next question. Another takeaway that quite a number of people have pointed out from this exercise, which they said, has only become stronger from previous exercises, has to do with separating elections management, which should be the core mandate of INEC, from the logistics part. The idea of getting voting materials to voting centers, transportation, and all the other things that have to do with logistics, the arrangement of stationery, payment of ad hoc staff, and all that should be should be outsourced to other parties, so that INEC can focus on elections management directly. Is this an idea that you would support, given what we know?
I think that's a risky idea. And I'll just tell you the few reasons why I think that's a risky idea. Number one is I think that INEC definitely needs to be reorganized, and it needs to be a little more, there needs to be more accountability within INEC, within the different parts of INEC. And perhaps within INEC, there should be very clear designated responsibilities on a national level for logistics. I think one of the issues that happened this election season, or at least on February 2025, was that at the federal level, INEC got polling materials to many states, or at least as our observers found, most states had received election materials by Thursday, Friday. But where the gaps happened was getting from the states to the various interlands. And you'd understand, you recognize that the challenges for getting materials to different parts of the interland are vastly different from the challenges of getting from state to state. Interstate travel may be convenient. Intrastate travel in this country tends to be a bit of a nightmare for people who have tried to travel intrastate. So I think that perhaps if there was more central coordination within INEC of how voting material gets to the last mile, as opposed to the people in the states and the wards and the local governments waiting on national, when they in fact need 3 days to sort out their own logistics, or they need 4 days to sort out their own logistics. So I think that it's really just better project management, better coordination within INEC that we need. I don't think we need to be creating new problems to solve, because once you try to outsource it to a different organization, now you have to deal with issues of accountability. Now you have to deal with issues of, who monitors them. Now you have to deal with other new issues that you otherwise wouldn't have with just one body coordinating everything. Now,
related to that, of course, is funding, the issue of funding. in previous election cycles, there have been conversations around the issue of funding. INEC, either receiving the funding very late or not, in some instances, receiving adequate funding at all. In this particular election cycle, INEC was to have received the funding for this election cycle about a year to the elections. That's what the law says. But we have found out that that wasn't exactly the case. And you did allude to it in your answer to the very first question where you talked about the cash crunch, because we all remember seeing the INEC chairman meeting with the CBN governor a few days to the election and then receiving assurances that, whatever it is that they needed by way of cash to be able to sort out some of the problems they would get. Now, whether they eventually did or didn't get that, is still up in the air. But I guess what the key question here is, are we on the right funding model for elections and for the election management body? Many of those who have had the opportunity to study elections management elsewhere point at a few examples from other countries which they say, could work better for us. What do you make of that?
I think that there was certainly an issue with INEC getting the cash it needed to operate in time. Yes, there was an appropriation of 305 billion in line with the Electoral Act about a year before the elections, or a little after a year to the elections. But certainly the actual cash to run logistics was not available. And again, like you said, we just had a spanner thrown in the works in the wheels at the last minute of this electoral process with this cash redesign policy, which created new problems that we otherwise might not have had. Perhaps if that had not been the case, INEC may have been able to. We might have been able to argue that INEC had money appropriated, and perhaps also that money was also moved into accounts that INEC had control over. We don't have clarity on exactly when INEC had cash in its accounts that it could use to run elections. So listen, Ladi, I think everywhere in the world, elections, most countries in the world, elections are run with federal funds, with funds that are appropriated by the legislature for the independent body that operates elections. In the US, for example, it's a little more decentralized in the US, where each local government has responsibility for funding and running their own elections. Even for national elections, they only get an appropriation that comes from the center. And if you look at places like India, it's almost similar. India operates a very unique system that I think is quite interesting, and Nigeria could perhaps learn something from, where the election process is staggered. And it takes about 5 weeks to conduct elections in India, and it's a mobile process where you're going from county to county conducting elections. So in terms of costs of the elections, I think the cost of these elections, it cost us 305 billion. That puts us at somewhere, depending on what exchange rates that you're using, it puts us at somewhere at a little under $10 per voter, about $6 per voter thereabout, to conduct these elections. Relative compared to places like the US that spend upwards of $20 per voter to conduct elections, and even in neighboring Kenya, they spend upwards of well over $10 to $15 per voter to conduct their elections. So the truth is that the 305 billion number is high, but considering the number of registered voters, it's not that high, and it's like 62% higher than what we had in 2019. But we have to remember that Naira has also depreciated since 2019 by close to that same number, close to 50 to 60%. So you have a case where there is a depreciation of the currency. So in real terms, the cost of election hasn't significantly gone up. What has what remains an issue is the waste that 305 billion contains. There's a lot of waste in that 305 billion. Millions and millions over, Yeaga did a bit of an estimate where they said about 200 million ballot papers had to be wasted. So there's a lot of waste in the system. The other issue, the other question that people are asking is that for the sums that we spend, and it's not just in Nigeria, it's across Africa, quite frankly, for the sums that we spend, are we getting commensurate value in terms of accountability and in terms of transparency? And I think that's the real question to be answered, to be asked and answered in terms of the question of value for money. You have places like the UK where they print ballot papers on very regular paper, but in Africa and even in places like Gambia where they use things like marbles, to just conduct elections as recently as a few years ago. So you have the question, the very real question, and in places like Brazil, where they simply just use an electronic voting system. So you have a question whether or not we're getting value for money for the amount of money that we spent, for the incremental amount of money that we keep spending on elections. And that's a debate that we certainly ought to have.
The role of political parties has come into sharp focus in this election cycle. I mean, they've been in focus previously, but particularly in this cycle, they've come into sharp focus. Maybe I should call it that. And I talk from the angle that, look, political parties are known as vehicles that candidates use to get political power. But in the electoral process, they have other functions which perhaps they've been ignoring. For example, we talked about the issue of party agents in elections, the issue of what are party agents supposed to do, what are their roles in the electoral process, especially now that quite a number of the parties are contesting the results of elections and going to court. And they are going to need the observations of their party agents at all the 176,000 plus polling units. But we have found out that it seems as if there's a disconnect between the parties and the so-called agents that they have at the polling units. Is this a lesson for you as a takeaway from this election? And what should the parties be doing before the next election cycle rolls around in this regard?
Ladi, I think that's an excellent question. The parties spend a lot of time focusing on campaigning, and they miss the critical element, how to monitor their votes, how to watch their votes and make sure that their votes count. Just about 48 hours to the election, a partner organization of ours, the Electoral College, got a call from one of the major parties, I won't mention which party, to train 100,000 observers within 24 hours using their online politry lesson. And you have a situation where parties are not. Parties have become essentially vehicles for political power, for attaining political power. We haven't built a deep system of political, and it's a big loss for our democracy, because ultimately people vote who the parties present to them. And where we really need the most reform, INEC can do the best that it can. But where reform is most needed is in the political parties. Because the political parties, the idea of a political party to begin with is that when the framers of democracy believe that people who know people are best to determine who can represent them. And that's the role that the political parties should play. The political parties ought to play a role where they not only register and educate members, but they also ought to play a role in helping us sort of serve as a first level audit of whoever is being presented to the general population. Because the general population only has a few weeks to decide based on sound bites on TV who is a credible candidate or not. The political parties have a lot longer. So we have to I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done, and I think INEC started work on this a little bit doing a bit of education with civil society, working with political parties, but a lot more still needs to be done to educate political parties on what the role of political parties in democracy ought to be, and how to make sure, very importantly, that their agents know what to do on election day and they do it, they collect the right evidence. It's not civil society role to be collecting evidence for political parties that they will use in court. It's the political parties and their agents who should do that job. You had cases where people were taking their own pictures and uploading to IREV. And we, at our organization, working with a few other civil society organizations, have put out the call for political party agents as well as citizens to help us upload the results that they took at the polling unit, but we're not getting those results because perhaps the political party agents didn't do that job to the best of their abilities. So that's certainly a gap that we've seen in the electoral process.
Then people talk about party membership. They talk about membership of the parties. That in other places you have lifelong members of parties who make financial commitment to the parties. They don't want political office, but they support the party on the basis of what it stands for. And that brings up the whole issue of the ideology behind the parties. We seem to have missed the bus on that one in terms of ideology-based political parties. You referenced the UK, you referenced the US, you referenced India in your answer to previous questions. In all those places, there are political parties based on ideology, and therefore people can identify with a party based on the value system and all of that, which also then leaves the question for one to answer. How important is it for there to be ideology, and how does that feed into the issue of committed membership, from which perhaps you can draw even things like party agents?
That's an excellent question, Ladi. I think that the question of ideology is a phenomena. It's not something that in many cases starts with the parties. If you think about the foundation of the US democracy that many of us look to with admiration, you had people like Hamilton, who was social democrats, and people like Thomas Jefferson, who was somewhat on the conservative side. But at the same time, you had people like John Adams, people like Aaron Burr, who switched parties just because he saw an opportunity to get elected vice president on the platform, elect a senator and then vice president on the platform of a different party. We're starting to see the emergence of ideologies, even within our political parties. We're starting to see the PDP sort of frame itself as the party of the private sector, the party that advocates the private sector, what you might call the conservative party. And you're starting to see the APC frame itself as the party of the masses, the party that seeks for social welfare and that advocates primarily for social welfare and wealth distribution. And then you're starting to see Labour Party as the party of the laborers and the party of the workers and the party of the young people. So you're starting to see certain ideologies form. The question is whether or not those ideologies will crystallize, will be given an opportunity to crystallize, or once people get into power, once we see, once the legislators get to power, the allure of sweet lucre, someone coming to lure a legislator, a Labour Party legislator, to cross carpet to PDP or APC, we're yet to see whether that will lead to a dislocation or what is beginning to coalesce or form as emerging party ideologies as people start to cross carpet. Indeed.
Would you support the setting up of an electoral offences tribunal or commission? Because that's, again, one of the tasks. You referenced it there that, up until this election cycle, you find that quite a bit of the evidence that political parties expect to present when they contest elections or they contest the outcome of elections come from civil society as opposed to coming from the organs put in place by the political parties themselves. So I'm wondering, INEC is joined in virtually every case because INEC is the election management body. But those who go after the electoral process, take away ballot boxes, steal and destroy beavers, and so on, should they be tried? Because really, we have rarely seen electoral offenses being punished. And that's why from election cycle to election cycle, people keep doing it. An electoral offenses commission tribunal, would you support that?
I think that's a phenomenal question, because a clear, very, very clear gap in the current Electoral Act and our current electoral process is who has accountability and responsibility, and who has the power to try and prosecute electoral offenses. The Act has several electoral offenses stipulated, including fines against the INEC chairman for the INEC, I said INEC chairman, different parties, including political parties, the coalition officers, and so on and so forth, for different offenses that may be committed, including the ballot box snatching that you talk about. But then the question is, whose job is it to prosecute? And one ostensible answer may be, oh, perhaps it is the police. But then what happens when you get to a national election and there's an incumbent party where the police to some degree is beholden to the incumbent party? Or you might say it's INEC, but has it been granted those powers? So I think that's one area where we may need some clarity. I am a big advocate of the Oluwatola report, or some version of it. I think that Nigeria already has too many different agencies doing the same things and duplicating efforts. So I would say that we should look to impose put those powers in an existing institution, say the ICPC, for example. It's supposed to be an independent corrupt practices commission. Let's put that responsibility with them so that we can delineate powers a little bit, and INEC is not both judge and jury in a case in which it is a possible complicit participant in a dispute. So I would say perhaps an independent organization like the ICPC might be ideal.
Indeed. Now, let's move on to something else that seems to have been one of the unique outcomes of this electoral cycle, and that's the multiple party representation that has come out of it. We've got a president-elect, yes, from one party. The vice is from that same party. But in the National Assembly, apart from the fact that all through the election cycles, there's been a high turnover rate in the National Assembly. Many have said that, that's not particularly good for the nation's democracy. But apart from the high rate, which had traditionally come from the two main political parties, now you've got eight political parties will be represented in this National Assembly. And some that I've read have said that's going to be a Tower of Babel, if you like, and that it might be difficult to get much done with so many disparate interests represented in the body already. Do you agree with that? Do you think that might stymie the National Assembly's ability to perform its roles within the democratic process?
I think that Nigeria has it good. It's just 8. Go to India, they have hundreds, over 300 political parties that vie for office. So we have it good. And I think that one of the collateral blessings of this electoral cycle is that we finally have a diversity and increased representation in the National Assembly, in the House of Representatives, we have the leading party, the majority party, having exactly 50% of the new seats, haven't won exactly 50% of the new seats, meaning that the opposition we now have a real opposition that is equal in power in terms of voting numbers to the ruling party. In the Senate, the ruling party still has a little more people, but again, this is where we expect coalition building to start to happen. I think that it's a great thing for our democracy. I think that it would be nice to see the opposition parties start to form coalitions to present a real, not just an opposition, but a principled resistance to the ruling party and to play the role that the legislature really ought to play and not just be a rubber stamp of what the executive does. So it's really what I call a collateral blessing, and I really hope that it becomes what it can be. It lives up to its potential, rather than people get into office and then just simply gravitate into the part of the bread that is buttered, which is the APC, the ruling party.
Are you not a bit disturbed that in previous circles where you've had one or two parties also get in, apart from the major parties, what you find, as you described it, is the gravitation towards, the part of the assembly where already things are quite well established and the perks of office can be more widely distributed. So are you not afraid that that may be the case this time around, that even though we have 8, we may end up with, the traditional 2 after, some time, some horse trading has gone on? I mean, we have seen that happen. This is Nigeria.
We certainly have. And I think this is where I would have to say that the leadership of the parties have to play a really strong role. The APC survived several years in opposition because it had a really strong leader. And I think that this is where people like Peter Obi and Rabiu Kwankwaso have to really stand up and be leaders of their parties. This is where leaders need to emerge within PDP that really galvanize their elected officials within the party to continue to provide principled resistance. I think it's also going to be important to see what happens on Saturday, quite frankly, because if Labour Party ends up picking Lagos State, then it becomes a really interesting opposition party that is similar to what Bola Tinubu and APC had for many years going. So I think that there's so many uncertainties. So much remains to be seen. But my sincere prayer is that we don't have business as usual, where all the who should be presenting principled opposition is simply cowed or bribed to simply be a rubber stamp.
You are executive director of the Center for Journalism, Innovation and Development. So my next question should be right up your alley, and that is the role that the media has played in all of this. Traditionally, you've got what is referred to as the traditional media, if you like, and they had always taken center stage when it came to elections. But this election cycle, more than all the others, had this disruption provided by online media, and even the traditional media, of course, have gravitated towards online to make their presence felt. But then you still have those that some of my friends have described as the buccaneer journalists who are on the online platforms and for whom anything goes. Misinformation, disinformation, trolling and all of that, demarketing has taken place in the course of this election cycle. Are you thinking perhaps that this is the way that it will be going forward, or have some lessons been learned about controlling this kind of narrative with a view for, to having us discuss issues and personalities where necessary within the context of correct information?
Thanks, Ladi. I think that the media and our constitution, the Constitution of the Federal Republic of Nigeria, Section 24, talks about the role of the media to be, of the press, to be the accountability leg of government. Media truly plays three roles in democracy. One is that it is a watchdog for our elected officials and ensuring democratic accountability. Two is that the media, at least the journalistic media, ought to help set the agenda. And this is not agenda that we pull from thin air. It's agenda that we get from being a part of the community. And finally, to be gatekeepers of the public sphere and making sure that the information that people get is founded on the principles of verification, of accuracy, of fairness, of balance, of humanity. And that's one of the things that has been really thrown up in the air to question, not just in Nigeria's elections, but globally. We have a media space with the advent of social media that is now subject to what the RAND Corporation calls truth decay, where we don't know necessarily what is true anymore, and people there's an onslaught on the truth. I'll give an example from the fact-checking that our fact-checking organization, Dubawa, did during this election cycle. We debunked about 100 claims thereabout in this election cycle, and many of them revolved around claims around people misrepresenting false claims of whether there was a crisis somewhere in order to suppress votes when there wasn't really crisis. There were false claims around media content or even election results from 2019 being presented as real results or doctored results from 2019 being presented as doctored results from this year. And you had, misinformation around people saying that this candidate has stepped down or this candidate has endorsed this person has endorsed this candidate, and all sorts of misinformation. But what was shocking and painful is that when fact checkers, and it's not just Dubawa, it was a fact checking coalition. When fact checkers and even folks like yourself in channels and channels TV, when the media then present facts that they verified to the people, the acceptance of the fact checks is based on the people's biases. People don't want information that doesn't align with biases. So once the information aligns with people's biases, they want to just retweet and upload and disseminate that information. And even when fact checkers then go out and do the work to say that, oh, this is not true, this is the evidence that it is not true, people then attack the fact checkers and say, who is fact checking the fact checkers? And how are we sure that the fact checkers are saying the truth? And then you then have people who then set up fact checking operations that are not really fact checking operations, they're just operations to spread disinformation in the nature of fact checks, in the form of fact checks. So there's the media ecosystem is really interesting, and it's tough. It's tough to see to say, how do you fight these wars? How do you fight these wars? And it's the role of media, and quite frankly, I'm grateful to channels and other accountability media organizations out there that play that role of standing the ground and being that gatekeeper of the public sphere. It's an important work, and many times it's a thankless job.
Now, I also know that you are an expert in the field of my next question, and therefore I want to use the opportunity of having you here to talk about that, because it featured very little in the campaigns. And for many other countries, this is the existential battle of the next couple of decades. And this is the issue of climate change, climate crisis, the issue of clean energy and development. Nigeria is still exporting fossil fuels and using cars that consume oil, petrol, and all of the other fossil fuels. But it does seem as if this battle of clean energy and renewable energy and increased use of gas and so on is going to be the battle of the next decade or so. So whether or not our political leaders are thinking about it or they've developed a plan, it's going to happen. Now, what exactly is it that they should be looking out for, at this point in time, given our unique position as a big producer of the current fuel, which so many are now seemingly moving away from?
Thanks, Ladi. I think I'll make 3 points in that regard. The first is that the energy transition is inevitable. Whether we like it or not, the energy transition will happen. We left the Stone Age because we had better tools for doing things than stones. It's the same thing. We didn't stop using horses and carriages because we ran out of horses. It's just because cars came around, internal combustion engines came around, and they were cheaper, faster, better. And that's really what it comes down to where the energy transition is concerned. The world will eventually gravitate towards cheaper, better, faster, cheaper, cleaner, faster. So that's the first point to be made. And we have to be prepared for that future. And what that means is that Nigeria is a gas-producing country. We are also an oil and gas producing country. A lot of the countries that we sell our oil and gas to have already made climate commitments that by 2030 to 2035, they will be going carbon neutral. The question is, if we go make the investments that many of us are saying we want to make, of building pipelines that run from Lagos, from Bonny Island, all the way through Morocco to Europe, or the Trans-Saharan pipeline that runs through Niger Republic and Algeria. The first one will cost $20 billion, the second one about $12 billion. If we go ahead and make those investments, the question is, at the time that it takes about 10 years to build, at the time that we finished building it, is there still a market to sell that power to sell that gas to? So there's a legitimate question to be asked whether or not there is going to be a significant market for our gas if we go ahead and make the big investment. There, however, is a big opportunity for us to retool our operations locally, domestically, to use a lot more of the resources that we have. So when the Vice President Yemi Osinbajo launched the Energy Transition Plan, I think that the new administration should really look closely at that plan, because I think at the moment it represents the closest thing. It's not a perfect document. I think that it's a document that has a lot of unrealistic numbers, a lot of unattainable goals, and things that do not clearly link to the realities of what we've experienced over the last few years. And I'll give an example. We're aspiring to get to 42 gigawatts of grid-based electricity generation by 2030. And the question I ask the framers of the document is, have we asked why in the last 20 years we've been trying to get to 10 gigawatts, we haven't crossed 6, and we all of a sudden believe that we will get to 42 by the end of 2030? Have we considered the downstream utilization of the energy? Because it's not just about having a lot of installed electricity generation. It's about, one, whether or not you can transmit that generation to the people that need it, and two, whether or not the people can afford to pay for it, or that businesses that they run, the industries that they run, are thriving enough to be able to sustain the energy that you're generating. So there are all sorts of cyclical questions that we ought to ask. But that said, that document perhaps represents I've looked at the manifestos of all the three parties. They're not what the paper they're written on, including the winning party. They're not what the paper they're written on, because they do not show any correlation with reality. But that document, the Energy Transition Plan, I think is a close document because it has a bit of a phased plan of how do we tackle some of the biggest challenges in the sector. I think one big challenge in the sector, like I alluded to before, is how do we get the power from the people who need it to the people who are making it. Nigeria's problem, many experts have said, is not generation. Between the generator in your home, Ladi, and the solar panels on my roof, and the generator in Dangote Cement, and the generators in Afam and in Kainji Dam, between all those generators, we generate enough power. The question is there a system that allows the power to be transmitted to the people where it's needed the most, and for the people who are generating that power and wielding that power to be paid for the power that they are transmitting? And I think there are lots of intermediate steps that we need to take to get there. So the second point to make is that, yes, we need to fix the domestic market for the power that we have. So whether it be right now, about 86% of our people still use firewood to cook. And that has not just climate implications, and the climate implications are worse than the oil and gas that people complain about. It also has immediate health implications for them. So those poor people in the rural areas, it has respiratory challenges and things like tuberculosis, things like pneumonia, and other respiratory tract diseases that people are exposing themselves to. We have to fix that, and we have to create a domestic market for our gas, because right now everybody who's doing anything gas wants to export it. So we have to create a domestic market where there is a cost-reflective tariff and people can sell gas domestically, and there's a market that is thriving, that is collecting that gas. On the final question of whether or not, of how do we then fix the power sector, I think that there are three things we need to do. Number one is that we need to fix the transmission grid. And I hope that whoever is going to be the Minister of Power is really thinking about this, because right now the transmission grid is perhaps the big bottleneck in the electricity sector. The Energy Transition Plan says it will cost us about $5.4 billion on an annual basis to fix it. That's expensive, both transmission and distribution. It's very expensive. Where will the money come from? So far, we've subsidized TCN close to the tune of 1.7 trillion only in the last 6 years, and we haven't seen great progress. So how do we fix that problem? I think that the solution lies in really breaking the system a little bit and creating independent system operators of a few of the distribution companies coming together and then concessioning out some of those transmission lines, so that those private operators, they are not owners, because we don't want to give away government assets to. There's a reason transmission is a monopoly. It's what you call a natural monopoly. You can't have 10 different people routing lines to my house and your house. It's a recipe for disaster. So it has to be a monopoly. But then the question is, who controls that monopoly? And there are national security implications as well. So you've got to figure out a way to concession them, and then government does the job of regulating them very carefully and doing a cost-limiting regulation to make sure that they don't overcharge and they don't exploit the monopoly access that they have. And on the distribution level, I think that the distribution companies, many of them are doing their best, but I think, and many of them complain that they don't get cost-reflective tariffs, but there's also a lot of accountability to be had. The distribution companies signed vesting contracts where they said that they will bring down aggregate technical, commercial, and collection losses from the highs of about 40% thereabout to a manageable number, and they haven't done it. They haven't made distribution investments, and that needs to happen, and there needs to be accountability in that regard, and people need to be metered appropriately, not billed exorbitantly, and that's when people will be able to accept a cost-reflective tariff. Because in reality, people already pay a cost-reflective tariff when they combine the blended cost of what they get from TCA, from the grid to their self-generation. they already pay a blended tariff. So they would very much appreciate to pay a cost-reflective tariff if they believe that there is accountability in the system down the line. And those are the challenges that the next administration, the new administration really needs to tackle. It's not going to be easy. Several people have tried in the past and struggled with it. But I think there are challenges that can be surmounted.
It did, and of course, so I did ask the right person about this question because your explanation was extremely detailed. One can only hope that those who are now vested with the power to take care of this will be listening to people like you and will take the necessary lessons for implementation. As you said, we have been around this cycle before. This is not our first rodeo, so we only hope that those who are going to be the rodeo drivers this time will be much better at it. Dr. Toby Oluwatola, thank you very much for your time on the program. It's been a pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you so much, Ladi, for having me, and thank you to the viewers too.
That's our program today. We would, of course, like to hear from you on the conversation. Our social media handles are right there on your screen. You can also listen to this and previous episodes of the program via our podcast. Please visit our website, channelstv.com, to get started. I am Ladi Akeredoluale. Goodbye.